Today we're going to talk about scaling, which is a very nice topic to illustrate the connection between physics and biology, which is something that we talked about last class. So let me start by showing you this very nice flash animation, which I already posted in Outspace. If you later you want to check it out again, you will find it on the resources. It's called Powers of 10. I call it Powers of 10. So what this is showing you is the size of the universe. So you go, this little bar here goes from the smallest things that we know of or that we have imagined with our theories to the biggest thing that we know of, which is the universe itself. Not the whole universe, probably, but the observable universe. That's the part of the universe that we have any chance of ever interacting with. The rest, we don't know what's out there. But so that goes from the smallest to the biggest. And moving the bar, it shows you the size of the different objects at the different scales of the universe. So at the bottom, at the left side of this, the smallest scales, physicists talk about strings. This is some prediction of string theory. We don't know if string theory is correct or not. But if it is, then there is these little strings that live in actually 10 dimensions. And most of the dimensions are very tiny. Anyway, the way they vibrate, they give rise to the different elementary particles that we know of. So all of the zoo of particles that we produce in particle accelerators will be simply different vibrations of this string. When we talk about in 126 about waves and the different modes of vibration of a string, then this is exactly what this is about. Also, modes of vibration of strings, and each mode represents a different particle. But this is speculation because we don't have any experimental proof that this is true. So from that smallest, which is 10 to the minus 35 meters, so the scale here is shown here in scientific notation, 10 to the minus 35 meters. So if you go up in scale, we have pretty much nothing there that we know anything for sure. All the way to, there's some particles there that we know that exist, but we don't know the size of them. So this is kind of a speculation to talk about the size of them at those scales. Like this is. This is not confirmed. The particles are confirmed, but not the sizes. And the first one that we have, that we're on firm ground, is the proton. The size of the proton is about 10 to the minus 15 meters. And we know that pretty well. If you keep going up, then we're talking about the size of the nucleus of an atom, which is of the order of 10 to the minus 14. Now, if you were looking at an atom, and let's go all the way to an atom, would you be able to see the nucleus? If this is an atom and you could, with your eyes, see an atom, can you see the nucleus? It looks like you can because in this picture you have to put something in there to show where the nucleus is, where the electrons are, but the proton is over here. You don't really see it there, right? At that scale, you won't be able to see it. You have to go all the way down 10,000 times to a smaller scale to be able to see the nucleus of an atom. So now let's go to higher scales, carbon atom, some big molecules, buckyballs, and DNA. The scale of that is 10 to the minus 4, about 10 to the minus 4 meters. Going up, then you start talking about viruses, the size of viruses, small bacteria and microorganisms, white cells, eggs, little animals, little insects, seeds, smaller animals, and finally humans. The size of a human, typically of the order of 1 meter, especially if you're my size, that's 10 to the 0. Right? So the power of magnitude that we're talking about there, the order of magnitude is 10 to the 0 meters, about 1 meter. So that's the scale of things that we interact with a lot in our everyday life. Let's go to bigger animals. Biggest living thing, General Sherman, a tree in California, a redwood. Giant sequoia. Biggest animal ever lived, the blue whale. Going bigger to size of, this is asteroids, big asteroids, Mount Everest, West Virginia, Italy, California, Now you start seeing their moons of different planets, the moons of Saturn, Jupiter, size of the USA compared to that, size of Mars, Earth, Venus. The small stars, Sirius B. There is Saturn, Jupiter, and we still haven't reached the size of the sun. And there is the sun. So compared to the size of the sun, of course, we can't even tell where the Earth is. Very tiny. Other stars like the sun you see there. Now keep an eye on the sun. I'm going towards bigger and bigger stars. Keep an eye on the sun. I think you already lost track of it. And we're not even there yet. My son's favorite star, VY Canis Majoris, the biggest star that we've ever observed. So that's about the size of the solar system. So if you were to put VY Canis Majoris where the sun is, it will go all the way to Neptune. So that's the size of the solar system, about 10 to the 13 meters. Going towards nebulas and small galaxies. Going towards the bigger galaxies like the Milky Way. So the scale that we're talking about there is 10 to the 21 meters. About 100,000 light years across. And you keep going to a bigger scale. Now we're talking about groups of galaxies. The local group where the Milky Way is part of, the Virgo cluster, superclusters of galaxies, structures that people have found in the universe at the biggest scales. They kind of look like strings. It's a very spongy structure that the universe has at the biggest scales. And then finally, the size of the observable universe, which is 10 to the 27 meters. Right? Like I said, beyond that, we have no idea what's out there. This is all we can ever hope to observe is 10 to the things that are as far as 10 to the 27 meters away. And we're pretty close, actually. This is, if I just go to 10 to the 25 meters, that's as far as the Hubble Space Telescope can see. So not too far from the beginning of the universe. All right, so what I have over here is, well, I put some markers here for interesting points there, different scales. So here we have the scale of the strings, the 10 to the minus 15 meters, the size of a proton, 10 to the minus 8 for the DNA molecule, 10 to the 0 for a human, solar system 10 to the 13, Milky Way 10 to the 21, and the observable universe 10 to the 27. Now it's interesting to see Newtonian mechanics, which is what you're going to be learning in this semester. Where does that apply? For what range of sizes of objects can we confidently use Newtonian mechanics and predict the motion of those kind of objects? That if you were to put a force on it, would they move according to F equal ma? So Newtonian mechanics, you can say that roughly this is not a sharp edge, of course, it just gets progressively worse towards the size of an atom. But you can say that you could apply Newtonian mechanics to the motion of a big molecule like a DNA. If it's folded like in a little ball and you apply a force to a DNA molecule, that thing will accelerate according to F equal to ma. So you can apply Newtonian mechanics starting at this scale, of course, all the way through microorganisms, small animals, big animals, much bigger animals, and size of the planet. Of course, you can apply Newtonian mechanics to predict the motion of the Earth around the sun. You can predict the motion of the sun around the center of the galaxy. And again, this is a fuzzy boundary. I don't know exactly where I would put a cutoff here, somewhere between the size of the solar system, 10 to the 13 meters, and the size of the Milky Way, 10 to the 21. That's where I would start not using Newtonian mechanics anymore because the effects of general relativity would probably be important. Galaxies move away from each other following the equations of general relativity. So I know that for sure I have to Newtonian mechanics is going to break down before that, but I can't tell exactly where that would be. But this is telling you that Newtonian mechanics is at least valid over 21 orders of magnitude, right? A 10, a 1 followed by 21 zeros. That's how important, how impressive, how useful this theory is. Now, if you also look at another range of scales, which is the range of scales for life, then, of course, you have a much smaller range of scales, but it's still a very impressive one. Life would start somewhere over here at 10 to the minus 6 meters or something like that, the smallest, probably less than that, the smallest organisms that we know of. There's debate about whether you call a virus alive or not, right? A lot of people think that they're not alive. Some other people think that because they replicate, they are alive, and so on. That's a debate. But anyway, if you start with a safe bed, which might be a mycoplasm, then the smallest life would be somewhere over here, and all the way to the biggest living thing, which will be that General Hermann sequoia that I told you before, that I showed you before. That's the size of that thing is about 100 meters or 300 feet tall, about 300 feet tall. So that's the biggest living thing that we know of. Sorry, here. So that means that life spans in 8 orders of magnitude, right? That is a gigantic stretch of distances and scales that life has inhabited. Now, talking about the biggest animals, this is also something that I put in Allspace if you want to check it out later. This is a little picture showing the size of the biggest animals and plants that there are, or I mean, sample of them. So you can see here, biggest animal, biggest thing alive, a giant sequoia tree, right? That thing is close to 300 feet tall. So in this picture, it would be, this is only 100 feet in distance here. So that sequoia would be 3 times that, right? The blue whale, right here, that's about a third of that, 100 feet long. And it's the biggest animal that's ever lived on Earth. You can see that a T-Rex compared to a blue whale is kind of a pygmy. Compared to an elephant, even smaller. Giraffe. So you can see a blue whale probably could have like a lunch of an elephant and a giraffe and a human and a dog. And that would probably be good. Other big dinosaurs here, Diplodocus. What else do we have? The biggest fish, which is a whale shark. Squid. This one's cool. Japanese spider crab. So this takes me to a very important question, which is what we're going to talk about today. The reason why I'm showing you this is to talk about scales and how size determines the structure and the function of animals. You might wonder from here, can you make an animal bigger than a whale? Can you have the same body plan of a cat and blow it up to the size of a dinosaur? Is that ever possible? Whenever you see in a movie, a science fiction movie, some sort of magical ray that you shoot at something and then you can blow it up, giant spiders and giant things happening in horror movies, is that really possible? Can you have an animal that has the same proportions as a spider? Can it be as big as a house? Right? So that's a question that has to do with scaling, and the answer to that is that the laws of physics have a lot to say about whether that is possible or not. So that's what we're going to explore in this class. So the question, like I said, that we are interested in tackling right now is, does the size of an animal affect the structure and the function of this animal? And what are the laws that are behind that? So let's start thinking about this. This is a picture of the skeleton of a cat and the skeleton of an elephant, and they're drawn to the same size. Right? So what are the differences that you can see in the structure of these two skeletons? What are the main differences? Go ahead. The what? A longer. That's a very important one. The rib cage of the cat is very short. It goes kind of all the way to the half of the torso. The elephant's rib cage seems to go all the way to the back. Right? What do you think that might be? Right. To support the weight of the stomach and intestines and all that. Which apparently, if you scale it up, you might not be able to support that just with the muscles. Yeah? The legs, that's right. If you compare the thickness of the femur of the cat and the femur of the elephant, that is a huge difference, right? Why do you think that might be? But notice that, an elephant, if you were to scale this, a cat to the size of an elephant, of course the thickness of the femur of the elephant, if you scale it that way, right, would be much bigger than the thickness of the cat, right? So you might think that, well, bigger legs should be able to support a bigger weight, right? So there is not really, at this point, we don't really know a good reason why the proportions of the elephant might change, right? Go ahead. The hips, Right, yeah, that's another difference that you can tell there. The thickness, of course, of the neck to support the weight of the head. So there's lots of differences. So that is pointing to the idea that you cannot just simply scale the skeleton of an animal, that to build a bigger animal, Mother Nature cannot just use exactly the same plan that it used for a small animal and hope that everything's going to be okay, because it's not going to be okay. So the answer to the question of does the size determine the structure and the function of an animal, the answer to that question is, of course, yes. You can say actually that size is a supreme and universal determinant of what an organism can do and can be. Why supreme? Supreme because the restrictions that the physics law apply or that put on an organism are supreme. They cannot be overcome because these are coming from laws of physics, right? So there's nothing an organism could do to overcome that. So that's why this is talking about a supreme determinant. And universal because they apply obviously to all animals, because the laws of physics apply, as I already showed you, that at least Newtonian mechanics, you can see that the range fully covers the range of life. So to tackle this question of how do the laws of physics determine the structure of an animal, let's start by establishing some common language here about scaling. So let's start by looking at a simple shape like a rectangle with dimensions A and B. You know that the area of that rectangle is A times B. If you were to blow up that rectangle, say that you multiply each side by a factor of 3. So you would end up with a much bigger rectangle, right? And the side of one side would be 3A, the other one would be 3B. So if that's the case, then the area of the new rectangle, which I'm calling the prime rectangle, A prime, will be A prime times B prime, which is A prime is 3 times A, and B prime is 3 times B. So that tells you that the area of the new rectangle will be 9 times as big as the area of the small rectangle. So by multiplying one dimension of the object by a factor of 3 in this case, I end up multiplying the area by a factor of 9. So the area does not scale linearly with size. It scales, as we're going to see, as the second power of any linear dimension. So in general, if I take an object and I keep the same proportions but blow it up, make it bigger, I can say that I'm going to multiply the linear dimensions by a factor of s, right? The scale factor. But does it mean that I'm going to keep the same proportions? Well, if I multiply both dimensions by a factor of s, then the proportions of this object, which are determined by the ratio between different dimensions of the object, the proportions of the big rectangle, which is B prime divided by A prime, you can see that is the same as the proportion of the small rectangle, right? If you scale up an object, then that means that you're multiplying the dimensions by s, which is bigger than 1. And if you scale it down, of course, you're multiplying the dimensions by a number that is smaller than 1, right? In terms of s, you can write the area of the new rectangle, right? Because every linear dimension got multiplied by s, so the new area is s squared times the area of the small rectangle. So the area gets multiplied, as we said, by a factor of s squared. We can also write an expression for the area of the rectangle in terms of any of the linear dimensions of the rectangle. This is going to be important for the discussion that we're going to do later. Suppose that I call the proportion of this rectangle, simple shape, I only need one number, which is b divided by a. I'm going to call that the proportion, alpha equals b divided by a. So I can write the area of this rectangle in terms of that proportion, because I could, for example, choose to keep a, and I write b in terms of the proportion times a, right? So I end up with alpha times a squared tells me the area of this rectangle. If it was a square, then you know that alpha would be 1, right? and the more elongated the square, then the different alpha is going to be from 1. But I can also write the area of this rectangle in terms of b, the other dimension, right? I just replace a with b divided by alpha. And so the area in terms of b will be b squared divided by alpha, right? So I can have either the area in terms of a squared, or I can write the area in terms of b squared, right? In both cases, the important thing is that in both cases, any linear dimension that I choose to calculate the area is going to show up as the square, okay? Now suppose that you had a set of rectangles, that somebody somehow gave you a set of rectangles, and they tell you the proportion. They say all of the rectangles I'm going to give you are going to have alpha equals 3, let's say, right? So if you're handed, somebody hands you one of these rectangles, right? And they ask you, what's the area of this rectangle? What's the fastest way that you can calculate the area? That is not just measuring both sides. Well, if you know already the proportions of the rectangle, you only have to measure one side of the rectangle, right? And use this equation. I already know the proportion. I know that all of the rectangles that I'm going to receive have the same proportion. So I can just measure one side of the rectangle, let's say the long one, and do this equation and find what's the area. That will be the fastest way to do it. You could also choose to measure another side of the rectangle and use the other equation. In both cases, as I said, all you have to do is measure one of the linear dimensions of the object. So we can write an equation that says that the area is proportional to any linear dimension of the object to the second power, right? If you look at all this series of objects, as you get the linear dimensions bigger and bigger, the area is going to grow not linearly, but it's going to grow like a parabola, right? With the linear dimension to the second power. For 3 dimensions, if we're talking about the volume of an object, let's start with a simple one. For this one, you have that the volume is equal to A times B times C. Okay, so if we're talking about the volume of this thing is A times B times C, of course, and if you scale up this object so that you multiply the linear dimensions by a factor of S, right? So then how does the new volume, can you express it in terms of the old one? Every linear dimension gets multiplied by a factor of S, so you end up with the new volume being equal to S to the third power times the old volume, right? Again, this only works if this object is a scale-up version of this one. That means you haven't changed the proportions of the object. So once again, if you're given a set of boxes and they all have, you know that they all have the same proportions, right? And you want to quickly measure the volume of that thing, what would be the fastest way to determine the volume of any of those boxes that have the same proportions? Well, if you have the set of proportions, if that's already given to you, one more time, you can write the volume of that thing in terms of any of the linear dimensions of the box. Choose A, choose B, or C. If you choose A, you can write the volume in terms of A as the third power of A, and the proportions go like 1 over alpha times gamma, where you have here how the proportions I define them, right? The proportions, in other words, is the shape, right? These are the numbers that determine the shape of the object. That's what we're talking about. So you can say that the volume is equal to some shape factor multiplied by a linear dimension. If you chose to find the volume in terms of B, then this factor will be a different thing, and if you write it in terms of C, it will be a different thing. But in all cases, as before, the important thing is that the volume is proportional to the third power of the linear dimension, right? So far we have said that any area, actually, this doesn't just apply to a square in 2 dimensions, but any area, even the surface area of a 3-dimensional object, is going to scale like the second power of any linear dimension. Any linear dimension. This means proportional, right? The volume scales like the third power, and another way to say that is that the area, if you change the area, if you have an object and you scale it up or down, the new area is going to be the scale factor to the second power, and the volume is going to change like the third power of the scale factor. Again, notice that I'm talking about, this is pretty general, so the shape of the object doesn't really matter. You could use your L. Suppose I give you a set of objects that have the same proportions, they have this shape, right? And I ask you to plot the area, the surface area of this thing as a function of, say, this dimension. You will get a parabola. If you plot it as a function of this dimension, you would also get a parabola and so on. It doesn't matter which linear dimension you choose. It could be something very complicated, like you measure this, and you add that, and you add this, and you add this, and you call that your L. The area, surface area of those objects are going to change according to L to the second power. Now let's have a little clicker question here. Make sure that you understanding so far. Let's say that you use a 2 gallons of paint to paint your house, right? How many gallons will you use to paint your dog's house, which is approximately 1/50 scale replica of your house? So think about it, calculate that. The right answer is A. Is as follows. The amount of paint that you need to paint anything depends on the surface area of the object, because that's where you're applying the paint, right? The coating of the paint is not going to depend on whether you paint in a house or you paint in a dog house, right? The coating will have a particular thickness that will depend on the viscosity and the size of the brush, I don't know, but that doesn't change. So really the amount, the surface area of the house is what determines how much paint you're going to use, right? So the amount of paint in this problem, since it depends on the surface area, and we know that surface area scales as the linear dimension to the second power. Any area scales like the second power of a linear dimension, right? So that means that the amount of paint required to paint these houses of different sizes but identical proportions would be proportional to the linear dimension of the house to the second power. So that means that if you take a ratio between the amount of paint that you need to paint the dog's house divided by the amount of paint that you need to paint the human house, that ratio of those amounts of paint will be equal to the ratio between a linear dimension. You have to pick the same linear dimension, of course. You could measure the size of the doors, for example, of the real house and the dog house, and that would be your ratio between L prime and L. Whatever linear dimensions you choose, you take the ratio of those and you square it, right? Now, a lot of people, I think, are not comfortable when they deal with equations that are something proportional to something, right? Maybe that's your case. So just turn it into an equation with an equal sign. When something is proportional to something else, that means that that quantity, in this case the amount of paint, is equal to some constant, right, multiplied by that variable that it is proportional to. So the equation that you could deal with, if that makes you more comfortable, is P equals C times L squared. That C is what we called before the shape or the proportions, shape factor, for example. So that can turn this into an equation with C L squared, L prime squared divided by C L squared. Of course, because the two houses are scale version of each other, the proportions are the same. So you can be sure that the shape factor is the same here. So that's going to cancel, right? So it's what I said before, that since P is proportional to L squared, the ratio of the P should be equal to the ratio of the L squared. Okay? So what is the ratio of the linear dimensions in this problem? The house size, any linear dimension, is S multiplied by the linear dimension of the real house, right? So your scale factor is 1/50, right? The dog's house is smaller than the human house. So that means that the ratio of those two amounts of paint should go like the scale factor to the second power, right? So there you have it. That's the answer for the problem. You have to take the scale factor and square it. So the amount of paint for the dog house will be the amount of paint for the human house multiplied by S squared. And that gives you 0.0008 gallons. Okay, so not linear, but square. Suppose that you coat this thing, this whole table. Suppose that you coat it with one coating of paint. How much paint is there on top of this table after you put the coating? The volume of that paint will be the area of the table multiplied by the thickness of the coating, right? Now say somebody asks you to coat both of these tables, right? So now the surface area is twice as big, so you're going to need twice as much paint, right? So the amount of paint should be proportional to the area of the tables. But we have introduced the language for scaling, but we haven't really answer the question of how does size affect the structure and function of an organism. That was the original question that we're looking to answer, at least to get an idea of how to tackle that. So let's get on with that. So this is where the physics comes in. For example, the strength of a muscle of an animal is proportional to the cross-sectional area of the muscle. How do we know that? Well, it turns out, this is actually from biology, it turns out that the muscle fibers are very, very similar across species. Pretty much any animal has the same kind of muscles that you do have. The muscle fibers are very similar. Muscle cells are almost identical. They're very, very similar across species. So what determines really the strength of a muscle, a piece of muscle, would be how many of these cells you have, how many of these fibers you have, right? Because every fiber can exert a certain amount of force. So if you put 10 of those fibers, then you can exert 10 times as much force as with one fiber, right? How many fibers can you pack in a muscle of this size? Well, the size of the fibers, as I said, is standard across species, so it only has to do with the area, cross-sectional area of the muscle, right? Cross-sectional area is a quantity, is an area, therefore, it should scale like the second power of the linear dimension of the animal, right? Couple more, the bone strength. How does the bone strength depend on the linear dimension? Well, it should go like the cross-sectional area of the bone. This is actually coming straight from physics, material science. So that's another quantity that's going to depend on the second power of the linear dimension, just like the muscle strength. The weight of an animal, another important quantity. How does that depend with the linear dimensions of the animal? How does that change as you make the animal bigger and bigger? Well, the weight should change like the mass, right? Weight and mass are very similar. Not the same, but very similar. And mass is proportional to volume, right? How do we know that mass is proportional to volume? If I take, look at a cat, a horse, or a cat, a person, a horse, an elephant, how do I know that the mass of that linear sequence of organisms goes like the volume, or that is proportional to the volume? Suppose I measure the volume of the cat. I put the cat in a tank, measure how much water is displaced, so that gives me a measurement of the volume of the cat. Then I put the person in the water, measure that, measure the volumes. Are those volumes going to be proportional to the mass of the animal, to the weight of the animal? They will be. Because the density of an object is equal to the mass divided by the volume, right? And the density of animals is very close to being the density of water. It's not exactly, but it's pretty close. So that tells you that the weight should scale like the volume. And with volume, we're talking about familiar stuff. Volume is a quantity that scales like the third power of the linear dimension. So that means that the weight of an animal should scale like the third power of the linear dimension. Another quantity, important quantity, is the diffusion rate. What does diffusion rate mean? Suppose that you have here a container separated, and two sides of the container, there's fluid on both sides, say water, whatever fluid you want, gas, and there is a permeable membrane here that allows for the motion of these particles across the membrane, but maybe it doesn't allow water to go through, but it allows, say, calcium ions to go through, right? So it's a semi-permeable membrane. So if you have on one side, you have a lot of, say, calcium ions, right? If the concentration here is bigger than here, then you know that the calcium ions are going to move this way. That's called diffusion, right? And diffusion, how much of these, or how many of these calcium ions per second, how many of them are going to cross this membrane, that is going to depend on the area of the membrane. It does depend, of course, on the difference in concentration between the two sides. That would show up in the full equation for diffusion rate. But the point that we want to make here is that it depends on the area. The amount of a substance that crosses a membrane per second should depend on the area of the membrane, and an area scales like the second power of a linear dimension, right? So how much food, for example, an animal can get inside the body depends on the linear dimension of the animal to the second power. because food has to go from the outside to the inside, which means that it has to go through a membrane, right? And the way to do that is through diffusion, because there is more concentration of the food on one side of the membrane, and there is few on the other side, then the food goes through, right? Another important physical quantity is heat conduction. Every time you have a hot object at a center temperature, that object is going to radiate energy. Either it radiates energy as an electromagnetic wave, or if it's in direct contact with another object that is colder, it also transfers heat. The heat will go from the hot object to the cold object. Heat conduction refers to the amount of energy lost that this object, hot object, is going to lose per second. How much energy is escaping the object, right? That heat conduction, through a physics equation that tells you that, also in that equation you have that the heat conduction is proportional to the surface area. So two objects, one same temperature, but one bigger than the other, the bigger object, of course, gives off more energy, more heat than the small object. That makes sense. But how much more is determined by the surface area of the object. Not by the volume, not by the linear diameter, say, of this balloon, but by the surface area of the balloon. So this, what I just showed you about the dependency, how different physical quantities depend on the scale, is something that can help us understand one thing that always, for a long time actually, when I was a kid, I thought about it, then I forgot about this thing for like 30 years, and when I started teaching this class, one day I remember my question when I was 6 or 7 years old, and I needed the answer, and that was kind of cool. So let me start by showing you a video of a car. So when I was a kid and I watched movies where there was a car that was falling off a cliff, right? Everybody knows that the car, when it gets to the bottom, is going to be in little pieces, right? Depending on how high this cliff is. But the damage is very, very big, right? If it has gasoline, then of course it could also explode and add to the damage. But even if there was no explosion, the car would be completely destroyed, right? Now, what interests me when I was a kid is that I was playing with little cars all the time, little toys, and I would just throw these cars in the air, and they would crash on the ground from a distance that, in proportion to the size of the car was much bigger than the distance from which this car fell off, and my toy cars would never get damaged. There would be hardly any damage on the toy cars. And you could read on the toy car that it was a scale model, 1/64 scale of a real car. And if you did the same thing to a real car, that's what would happen. If I did something like that to my toy car, nothing would happen. So I wondered about that, like I said, for a while, and I just didn't know what the answer for that was. The reason why the small car is not damaged and the big car is completely destroyed is the same reason why I had a cat here before. If a cat jumps from a second floor, a balcony, oh boy, all right. Then the cat will probably walk away, run away, and there won't be any damage on the cat, right? Most likely. But if a human does that, you'll probably get a broken leg, right? That's the pain symbols here. Okay, so what about a horse? Same jump from a horse? Probably deadly, most likely deadly, right? At least 4 legs broken and some ribs. No. If an elephant does the same thing, I think it will be mush at the bottom of the fall. So that is totally related, or the answer or the reason why this would happen is the same reason why my toy cars would survive the fall and not a real car. So let's start by thinking about the strength. Let's say in the case of these animals that had this unfortunate fate, what is the strength of the bones of these animals? We already said that the strength of the bones is proportional to the linear dimension of the animal to the second power, right? The thickness of the bone determines the strength of it. What determines the force of the impact? Once this object hits the ground, what is the force with which the object is going to hit the ground? I think you will agree that that impact must be proportional to the mass of the object. The heavier the object, the bigger the impact with the ground, right? So if you compare the bone strength with the force of the impact, right? Given the fact that the bone strength is proportional to the second linear power of the linear dimension and the force of the impact is proportional to the third power, if you take the ratio of these two quantities, you end up with 1 over L, right? So what happens to the ratio as you increase the size of the animal? If you take a cat and then you blow it up, and you blow it up, and you blow it up, what happens to the bone strength divided by the force of the impact? And you throw these cats off the balcony. What happens to this ratio? It gets smaller and smaller. So what that is telling you is that the bigger cats will be more fragile, right? There will be a point where the force of the impact will be bigger than the bone strength, right? All you have to do is make a bigger cat so that eventually this is bigger than this, so that 1 over L is smaller than 1, right? There is some constant here, of course, doesn't matter. So the force of the impact grows faster than the bone strength, and that's what's behind this behavior. The force of the impact scales like the third power of the linear dimension. The bone strength goes only like the second power. So bigger animals tend to be weaker animals. If they fall, if an elephant, for example, just as much as trips, it can break one of the ribs. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So a 2-story high cat is sitting on top of a house, let's say. Okay, and that cat jumps, right? When it hits the ground, it's going to be completely destroyed. That it can just step. If it can step to the ground, then sure, right? Yeah, because then in that case, you don't have a force of impact, right? But if it was just put in the air and then let it go, yeah. All right, so bigger animals are more fragile than small animals, right? So now let's think, if you wanted to make scale-up version of a cat, which can jump off a balcony safely, what would you do? What would you have to change in the design of the cat? Well, the answer is that the bones cannot just scale the way we said they would scale, like L to the second power, because we said that the weight of the cat would scale like the third power of L, right? So as I'm repeating what I just said, if I just take a cat and just scale it up, the cat gets weaker. So what do I have to do to make sure that the cat can jump off this balcony safely? Well, I have to make the bones thicker. And they cannot just grow proportionally to the size of the cat, as we did it before. You have to actually make them grow faster than the second power of the linear dimension. So you have to get disproportionately bigger bones for that cat to be safe jumping that distance. So what you have to do is, at least, you will have to make the bone strength grow as the third power of the linear dimension of the animal, because the mass is already growing like the third power of the linear dimension. So to compensate for that, to make sure that the bone strength grows at the same rate as the mass of the animal as you make it bigger and bigger, you have to make sure that that bone strength grows like the third power. So if the bone strength grows like the third power, that means that the cross-sectional area of the bones of these animals would have to be proportional to the third power of L. Right? Because that's proportional to the bone strength. Bone strength is proportional to the area. So that means that if you took a bone of this animal, this cat, right, this mutant cat, you take the mass of that bone will be equal to the cross-sectional area times the length of the bone, which grows like a linear dimension. So the mass of these bones will grow like the fourth power of the linear dimension. So in your genetic experiment, designing a cat that is strong to jump off bigger cats strong enough to jump off the second balcony, you'll have to make this series of cats with bones, with a skeleton mass that grows like the fourth power of the linear dimension. Now you can see that that might be a problem, right? Because the skeleton mass grows like L to the fourth power, but the mass grows only like the third power of the linear dimension. Yeah, that's right. If I were to keep the proportions of this cat the same, right, so that a small cat would look just like the big cat, then A will be L squared. And we know that that doesn't work because we get a weaker and weaker animal. So to keep the strength of the animal the same, you'll have to make the area grow faster than L squared. The least you should do is to make it grow as L to the third power. Okay? Now, if the area of the bone scales like L to the third power, the mass of the bone would scale like L to the fourth power. Because the mass of the bone, if you think of a cylinder, will be roughly the cross-sectional area multiplied by the length of it. So the mass of the skeleton of these animals will be proportional to the fourth power of the linear dimension. But the mass, the total mass of the animal only grows like this. So what do you think that happens? As you grow, you keep this recipe and you keep growing your animals, what happens? Exactly. So the animal will be just bones. Pretty soon there will be no place for you to put any muscles to move this animal. So you're talking about an animal that is strong. Yeah, you can drop it from the second floor, but the animal cannot move, right? So that is not good. So Mother Nature surely cares about not making animals more fragile, right? But definitely Mother Nature cannot keep up with this L to the fourth power, right? So what's going to happen is that bigger animals are going to be weaker. So what is the compromise that Mother Nature has found? This tells you what that compromise is. This is the different quantities of animals. This is mammals. And the equation that you're seeing there, the A and B that you see there are simply the quantities in this equation. So this quantity is a y. Replace, if you're talking about surface area, then y is surface area. Surface area is equal to some constant, right, which is b over here, multiplied by the linear dimension of the animal to the power a. Okay, so surface area, when you measure the surface area of a series of mammals, right, that surface area, when you compare it to the length of the animal, you might measure the length of the neck of the animal, you might measure the height of the animal, the length of the tail, I don't know, any linear dimension, if all of these animals have the same design, then that's your L, right? So for the skeletal mass of a terrestrial animal, you can see that the mass of the bones scales like the 3.25 power. So it is more than 3, but it's less than 4, which we predicted, right? If the animal's strength had been kept constant, then A would have to be equal to 4. But that would leave an animal without any muscles to make it move, and that's not good. It would get killed easily. So the compromise that Mother Nature found is between 3 and 4, it picked 3.25. That gives you an animal that is not as fragile as it could have been, but is not as mobile. So it's a compromise between those two properties. Something interesting to notice here is that the skeletal mass is for cetaceans, right, whales. Basically, the coefficient is 3. So what that is telling you is that, well, whales never fall off a cliff, right? They don't have that problem of having to have bones that are strong enough to support the wave when it lands or just to support them, right? Because they float. There's pretty much no gravity there, effective gravity. So they don't have that problem, so they can just scale. So a little whale has the same bone structure than a big whale. And when you blow up, take a picture of the skeleton of the little one, you blow it to the size of the big one, you compare them. You don't see any difference as we saw between the cat and the elephant. Surface area of in these mammals grows pretty close to 2 because it's a surface area, it's an area, and we said that the area scales like the second power of any linear dimension. So the coefficient that you're expecting here is 2. It is a little smaller than 2 when you actually make the measurements in animals. And that probably has to do with the fact that bigger animals have thicker bones, and thicker bones end up resulting in a rounder body shape, and round things have less surface area than spiky things, right? So that would mean that this, that probably explains why this is not 2, but a little bit less than 2. Now a very interesting one, and I do have time for it, so that's cool. It's metabolic rate. We mentioned that before with the problem of the painkiller that you give the elephant and you killed it because you gave the elephant 2,000 milligrams, and it shouldn't. That was too much, right? So that has to do with the metabolic rate. Metabolic rate scales like 2.25 with the linear dimension of the animal. So what is metabolic rate? Well, metabolic rate is basically the energy that the animal uses per unit time. It's usually measured in calories per day. So depending on your metabolic rate, you use more or less calories in a day, of course. Now, how should that rate scale with the linear dimension of the animal? Let's see if we can predict that. We can make a prediction about that. It is a fact that all animal cells are pretty much the same size. Like I mentioned with the muscle fibers, they look very much the same across species. The size of a mouse cell is not smaller than the size of an elephant cell. It's not. It's about the same size. It's just that an elephant has many more cells, of course. But the cells are not bigger. So if you think about that, you might conclude that if all the cells are about the same size, they will probably use the same amount of energy. The cell of a mouse might use the same amount of energy as the cell of an elephant. If that is a hypothesis. If that is true, then what can you conclude from that? Well, the metabolic rate of one cell of a mouse, if it is equal to the metabolic rate of one cell of an elephant, then the metabolic rate of the whole animal should be equal to the number of cells that the animal has multiplied by the metabolic rate of one cell, right? If one cell uses 1 microcalorie per day, then an animal that has 10 trillion cells will use 10 trillion times that 1 microcalorie per day, right? That's pretty simple. So that's what you would expect. So that means that the metabolic rate of the whole animal should be equal to the mass of the animal divided by the typical mass of a cell. That will give you the number of cells that that animal contains, multiplied by the metabolic rate of one cell, right? So if my assumption is correct, if the metabolic rate of one cell of a mouse is the same as the metabolic rate of one cell of an elephant, this should be true. And if that is true, then you can just rearrange the terms and see that this thing is a constant. You know, the metabolic rate of one cell divided by the mass of a cell, that should be sort of a standard, multiplied by the mass of the animal. So the metabolic rate of the whole animal should be proportional to the mass of the animal, right? And that's what most doctors assume. When you're dealing with humans, the differences in size of humans is not that great, and this is a good approximation. So if that were true, then the metabolic rate should scale like the mass, and mass scales like the third power of the linear dimension, right? So when you measure metabolic rate, in this table that I showed you before, you would have expected that the metabolic rate would have an A equal to 3, but it isn't. It's 2.25. That's what we saw in that table. So what is that telling you? What does that tell you about this assumption here? That is wrong. The metabolic rate of one cell of a mouse is not equal to the metabolic rate of one cell of an elephant. Which one is bigger? The mouse. The metabolic rate of one cell of the elephant should be lower than the metabolic rate of the mouse. If it wasn't, then if it was the same, the A would be 3, but it isn't 3. So the reason why should the metabolic rate of one cell of an elephant be slower than the metabolic rate of a mouse? The reason why, that was not known for 60 years. In 1932 was the first time that scientists were aware of this problem of the metabolic rate, when this guy, Max Kleiber, published his results of the metabolic rate, calories per day, with respect to body mass. So he measures that metabolic rate. He does it in a log-log scale. So he's taking the logarithm of the mass, and this is the logarithm of the scale is the logarithm of the metabolic rate. Right? This is a log-log scale where if this is the equation that you have and you take the logarithm on both sides of the equal sign, you end up with logarithm of the metabolic rate equals some constant plus 3 over 4 will be the slope of the line multiplied by the logarithm of the mass. So if you plot this is your x versus this is your y, you get a straight line, and the slope is 3 over 4 from the experimental data. So just to make a conversion to what we've been talking about, this is showing you the metabolic rate from this plot, log. You measure the slope. That slope is going to be, gives you a coefficient of 3 over 4. So what this guy discovered was that the metabolic rate scales like the mass to the 3 over 4 power. That's what this line is suggesting. You see that it fits the data really, really nicely. So that's what you have. How is that in terms of the linear dimension of the animal? Well, that's not hard to do because the linear dimension, the mass scales like the 3rd power of the linear dimension. So the metabolic rate, discovered by Max Kleiber, scales like the linear dimension of the animal to the 9 over 4 power, which is 2.25, right? That's what I showed you before in the table. The metabolic rate scales like 2.25 of the linear dimension. This is what this plot is showing you. So in 1932, people became aware of this, and for 65 years, this was one of the biggest mysteries in biology. It even got worse in the 60s when there were more data added to this plot, and people were able to see that, for example, warm-blooded animals, if you plot the metabolic rate with respect to the mass, you get a straight line, and the slope is 3/4. If you do the same plot for the cold-blooded animals, then you get the same slope, 3 over 4. And if you get a plot for unicellular organisms, you still get 3 over 4, right? The lines have the same slope, the intersects are different, and that seems to be associated with the body temperature of the organism. So this was really a big mystery for 65 years. Until 1997, when there was an article published in Science by 3 scientists. One was Geoffrey West from Los Alamos, a physicist. The other one was Brian Enquist from Arizona University, ecologist, and another ecologist from the University of New Mexico, James Brown. So what they figured out was that it was all about the geometry. Geometry is all you need to solve this puzzle. And I cannot show you the details there, but I'm going to tell you what the idea is, what the basic idea is. Just some animal there, just like a cube, doesn't matter. And inside the animal, typically an animal would acquire some resources from the environment, right? Fuel, oxygen, and so on. Those resources will be inside the organism somewhere, right? If it's food, they will be in your stomach, right? If it's oxygen, they will be in your lungs. Whatever the resources are, they need to be transported to every single cell of the body. Every single cell needs oxygen and it needs fuel, right? So how do you transport? What is the most efficient way? They wonder, the question that they tackled was, what is the most efficient way to transport stuff from some localized place to every single place inside that volume, right? It's sort of similar to the problem of a delivery person having to do certain deliveries in a city and trying to figure out what's the best way to do it, right? Do you go first here, and then you have to go back, drive back this way, take the highway again and deliver here, and then you go this? Surely there must be some optimal way of delivering according to where you have to go, right? So that you drive the least amount of distance. So the same thing for an organism. The most efficient way turns out to be something that is called a fractal. The structure that you end up with when tackle this question is a fractal. So what's a fractal? A fractal is, for example, you have an example of one here. You can start by drawing a triangle. You draw triangles on the sides of the triangle. And on the sides of that triangle, you draw triangles again. And on the sides of those little triangles, you draw triangles again. This is called a self-similar structure. It's called a fractal. They've been popular in physics and math for like 30 years now. So these guys figure out that the best way to deliver the nutrients, the most efficient way, was with a fractal structure that starts with a big channel. The nutrients are carried in these big channels, and then that splits into smaller channels with a specific rate, at a specific ratios, and then that channel splits into another, and then that splits into another, and into another, and the most efficient solution to the problem can be calculated, and it has some specific parameters about the thickness of the say the artery, which is the biggest of the channels, right? Taking, for example, blood from the heart to the different parts of the body. First you have the artery, then that artery splits into two, let's say, and the diameter of this. From this mathematical construction, you can figure out what's the most efficient way to do it, and sure enough, nature does it the most efficient way, right? It's been optimized, and the result is some sort of fractal structure with very specific properties. Now, even when nature does it with the most efficient way, it's still, as the mass of the animal increases, even the most efficient circulatory system design, it cannot keep up with the demands of the individual cells that are forming the organism. There's just too many of them, right? So what you end up having is that the metabolism of the cells has to slow down because the circulatory system, not even the most efficient one, cannot keep up with that. It cannot deliver energy at the rate that these cells would require, right? So the metabolism has to go down. So out of this model, as I said, you end up with specific predictions about different quantities. For example, the metabolic rate is something that comes out of this model. And from this mathematical theory with fractal structure, you get 0.75 as the scaling factor there. Other quantities that you can predict is the cardiac frequency of animals, which decreases with size, the oxygen consumption and respiratory frequency, some others, and many other parameters that match pretty well with what's been measured. All right, that's it for today.